Mara Klein fixed leaking boilers in an aging suburb outside Briar Hollow. Her work kept apartment radiators warm through long, wet winters. She owned a small plumbing company with one van and one apprentice. Invoices lived in a stained binder beside her coffee and spare washers. The business survived because Mara charged fairly and returned calls. She liked explaining repairs to anxious tenants without talking down. Her apprentice, Devon, learned fast and wrote neat service notes. On Fridays, they stocked copper fittings at the same supply counter. Mara still kept her union card from years of commercial work. She believed rules mattered when they protected people from harm. The suburb council, however, treated rules like a private language. A few members had children who ran their own home service businesses. Those children advertised loudly and underbid everyone during election years. Mara never accused anyone openly because proof matters in court. She simply noticed which companies got quick permits and gentle inspections. Her own job sometimes stalled because an inspector arrived late or not at all. One Monday, a property manager called about a daycare with no hot water. Mara cleared her schedule because children need sanitation more than comfort. The daycare sat in a converted bungalow behind a busy arterial road. She replaced a failed mixing valve and tested temperatures twice. Devon documented the repair with photos, serial numbers, and timestamps. Before leaving, Mara pulled a permit application from her clipboard folder. The manager sighed and said inspectors kept rejecting their paperwork. A competing company had offered to handle permits for a steep fee. Mara told him permits were public process, not a concierge service. She filed the permit request online from her phone in the parking lot. 2 days later, an email arrived with a violation notice attached. The notice claimed she performed regulated work without prior approval. It listed a fine larger than the entire job, plus inspection costs. Mara read the ordinance twice and felt her jaw tighten. Emergency repairs were allowed, as long as permits followed promptly. Her submission timestamp proved she filed before the next business day. The email also warned that repeat violations could suspend her license locally. Devon asked if they should pay and move on. Mara refused because paying would label her work as reckless. She called the municipal office and waited through 3 transfers. A clerk finally said the inspector marked the job as non-emergency. Mara asked for the inspection report, but the clerk said it was internal. She requested an appeal form and was told to attend the next hearing. The hearing date sat 5 weeks away, and interest would accrue meanwhile. At home, Mara balanced bills at her kitchen table under harsh light. Her van needed brakes, and Devon expected a raise after probation. She felt fear not as panic, but as careful arithmetic. If you run a tiny company, one bad fine can erase months. Mara also worried about the daycare being blamed for her supposed misconduct. She called the manager and promised she would contest the notice. He sounded relieved, yet he mentioned council members often sided with inspectors. Mara slept badly and replayed every step of the repair. In the morning, she printed the ordinance and highlighted emergency language. She decided facts would be her only defense and her only weapon. Mara visited the municipal records window and asked for all documents. The attendant slid a form forward and said requests required a fee. The fee was small, but the processing estimate was 30 business days. Mara paid anyway and wrote the daycare address in block letters. Devon spent the afternoon gathering their photos and service notes. Mara called a retired inspector she knew from commercial jobs. He said municipalities sometimes labeled emergencies narrowly to discourage small operators. He advised her to ask which definition the department used internally. Mara emailed the department that exact question and saved a copy. The reply came a day later and contained only a link to the ordinance. That omission felt deliberate, yet it remained technically polite. A week later, another notice arrived, now calling her a repeat offender. It referenced a prior address where she had replaced a sump pump. Mara remembered that job, and she remembered obtaining a permit first. The new notice said the permit was invalid because of a missing signature. She checked her files and found the signed approval scanned clearly. Mara suspected someone altered the department file after the fact. Devon watched her hands shake once, then he quietly made tea. They drove to the municipal building and asked to view the permit record. A supervisor said viewing was allowed, but copying required another request fee. Mara stood at a counter reading the screen while people queued behind. The file showed a signature box left blank and a note added months later. Mara asked when the note was added, and the supervisor said timestamps were confidential. He offered to waive part of the fine if she admitted fault. That offer sounded like mercy, yet it demanded a false confession. Mara refused, and the supervisor reminded her that hearings could uphold penalties. Outside, Devon asked if fighting would anger the department further. Mara admitted she did not know, which made her feel exposed. She called a legal aid clinic, but they served tenants, not contractors. A private attorney quoted a retainer that equaled 2 months of revenue. Mara considered taking a loan, then pictured interest compounding quietly. She instead researched administrative hearings late into the night. She learned evidence rules were looser, but procedures still mattered. Mara drafted a timeline showing permits filed, approvals received, and work completed. Devon printed the daycare photos and labeled each temperature reading. They asked the daycare manager for a statement about the water outage. He signed it, noting children were sent home because sinks ran cold. Mara worried the manager might face retaliation for supporting her. She advised him to keep communication factual and save every email. 3 weeks passed, and the records office sent a thin envelope. It contained a single-page summary, not the full inspection report. The summary repeated conclusions without describing observations or measurements. Mara filed a second request, narrowing the scope to metadata and timestamps. The office replied that metadata was not maintained for legacy systems. Mara recognized a loophole because the city recently upgraded its software. She visited the procurement portal and searched public contracts and vendor manuals. A manual online described audit logs for edits, deletions, and user accounts. Mara printed that page and attached it to a new records request. This time, the response was slower, and the tone felt more guarded. Meanwhile, a council newsletter praised a new business grant for youth entrepreneurs. The newsletter featured a smiling photo of a council member's son in uniform. His company offered plumbing and advertised permit handling as a premium add-on. Mara felt sick because the connection was suggestive but still circumstantial. She kept her focus on documents because motives rarely win hearings. The hearing notice arrived with a packet listing the department's evidence. Their evidence included screenshots, but no raw file history or author names. It also included a policy memo defining emergencies as life-threatening events. The memo was not published publicly, and it contradicted ordinance language. Mara realized the department could enforce the memo while claiming legality. If you have ever argued with bureaucracy, you know how words can shift. She prepared to challenge whether an unpublished memo could override law. A day before the hearing, Devon called saying the van was towed. Parking enforcement cited an expired commercial permit sticker on the windshield. Mara had renewed it, but the new sticker never arrived by mail. The tow yard demanded cash, and the clerk refused to check the database. Mara paid because missing the hearing would cost far more. That night she felt cornered, and she briefly considered settling. She opened the daycare photos again and remembered the cold sinks. The next morning, Mara wore her cleanest work shirt and carried a binder. The hearing room held plastic chairs and a long table with microphones. A hearing officer greeted everyone politely and explained the process in calm terms. The department representative presented the memo as standard operating guidance. Mara argued that guidance could not narrow an ordinance without notice. The representative replied that the ordinance allowed discretionary interpretation by inspectors. Mara submitted the daycare statement and her permit submission timestamp. The officer asked why she did not wait for approval before repairs. Mara explained children were sent home and sanitation required immediate restoration. The officer nodded, yet he said the department could still impose fines. Then Mara introduced the second allegation about the sump pump permit. She presented her scanned approval with signature and the date received. The department representative claimed the scan could be altered after the fact. Mara asked for the system edit logs described in the vendor manual. The representative said logs were not produced because they were not requested properly. Mara handed the officer her printed request, showing she cited audit logs explicitly. The officer paused and asked the representative to explain the denial. The representative said retrieving logs burdened staff and could expose sensitive information. Mara offered to accept redactions that removed personal details of unrelated records. The officer ordered the department to produce relevant logs within 10 business days. Mara felt a cautious lift because the process finally moved forward. Outside, Devon smiled for the first time in weeks. 10 days later, the department produced logs showing the sump permit was edited. An account named after a supervisor had removed the signature field entry. The edit occurred months after approval, 2 days before the repeat notice. Mara submitted the logs to the hearing officer with a short explanation. The department responded that edits corrected data integrity issues discovered later. That explanation sounded plausible, yet it ignored Mara's valid scanned approval. The officer scheduled a continued hearing and requested testimony from the inspector. The inspector appeared and said emergency meant imminent injury, not inconvenience. Mara asked whether the department trained inspectors using the unpublished memo. He admitted the memo was distributed internally after complaints about inconsistent permits. Mara asked whether the memo was approved by council or posted publicly. The inspector said no, because it was considered operational and temporary. Mara then asked why her sump permit was edited without notifying her. The inspector said supervisors sometimes cleaned files when contractors were under review. That sentence hung in the room, ordinary sounding and deeply troubling. If you listen closely in hearings, the truth often arrives like that. The hearing officer asked the department why contractors would be singled out. The representative said reviews targeted patterns of non-compliance, not individuals. Mara produced her last 20 permit approvals, showing timely filings and passing inspections. She also produced comparison data from public permits issued to a competitor. The competitor had multiple emergency approvals granted retroactively without penalties. Mara stated she sought equal application of rules, not special treatment. The officer requested the department explain the inconsistent enforcement pattern. The department asked for time to submit a written rationale and supporting documents. A month later, the written rationale arrived with vague language and no data. It argued discretion prevented misuse of emergency exemptions by unscrupulous contractors. Mara replied that discretion without transparency invites selective punishment. She asked the officer for a ruling that the memo could not be enforced. She also requested dismissal of both fines and reimbursement of record request fees. The officer took the matter under advisement and closed the record. Weeks passed with no word, and Mara kept working while watching cash flow. Some customers hesitated after seeing the violation posted on a public docket. Mara cut her own pay to keep Devon employed and insured. She felt resentment, then corrected herself, because bitterness can cloud judgment. The decision arrived by certified mail on a windy Tuesday afternoon. The officer ruled the daycare repair qualified as an emergency under the ordinance. He vacated that fine and ordered the department to remove the violation entry. Regarding the sump permit, the officer found the file edit undermined due process. He dismissed the repeat offender allegation and referred the audit logs for review. The ruling also required the department publish any emergency guidance for public comment. Mara read that paragraph twice, then sat down hard in her chair. Devon asked if they had won, and Mara said yes quietly. The department refunded her record fees and tow costs as consequential expenses. It was not life-changing money, but it stabilized her business. A local paper covered the decision and quoted the transparency requirement. Other small contractors called Mara to ask how she documented permits. Mara shared her templates and urged them to keep clean timelines. The council held a meeting where residents questioned why guidance was hidden. A council member defended the department, saying it acted within its discretion. The hearing officer's order forced a policy revision vote the next month. The revised policy defined emergency work clearly and required written justifications. It also mandated that permit file edits trigger automatic notice to contractors. Mara kept her binder, but now it felt like preparation, not protection. She returned to the daycare for a routine check and was greeted warmly. Driving back, she admitted she still feared the next letter or fee. She also felt steadier because the rules had been forced into daylight. If you ever feel small against paperwork, remember that records can talk. Mara kept fixing boilers, but she also kept watching how power signs forms. In Briar Hollow, the warmth in buildings now came with a little more fairness.